Cheers, everyone. Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you for joining me. On the right, in the Republican Party, conservatives, we have this rift between neocons and I guess I would call them paleoconservatives, libertarians, over the issue of foreign policy and how aggressive the United States should be as far as provoking conflict in other countries, or just using our military power to push other countries around and target countries that we say are full of bad people. And when Donald Trump came around in 2015, he announced he was going to run for the Republican nomination. He was generally attacked by all the neocons and all the conservatives, saying he was a joke and they didn't really quite understand the force that he would become. And frankly, a lot of us didn't either. But as he gained momentum, more and more conservatives who had neocon backgrounds started to come around. I think a lot of that was because they had no choice. If you're a mainstream talk show host, and how are you going to have a show when you don't support the Republican candidate for president? But even then, some of these people said, if he wins the nomination, I don't know if I can support him in the general election. But eventually, most of them came around, except, of course, for the famous Never Trumpers. And one of the things that Trump did during the debates in 2016 was he called out Jeb Bush for being part of the Bush family, a neocon family that is responsible for two wars that really cost us a lot of blood and treasure. And when he called them out, the crowd at this debate, they cheered loudly. They were glad to see a Republican finally call out the neocons. So Trump has had to drag these conservatives in the mainstream, drag them away from these foreign wars and away from these neocon foreign policies. But the problem is, deep down, they still have these neocon tendencies. And when Iran shot down that drone, John Bolton, he wanted Trump to bomb Iran so bad, and when Trump wouldn't do it, John Bolton, he freaks out, and of course he left the administration and wrote his book and went on the tour to hate on Donald Trump. And John Bolton, by the way, of course, he's a terrible human being. If he had it his way, he'd bombed half the world. So he's an awful neocon, and no one should ever take him seriously. But again, during this Trump presidency, we were slowly moving away from these neocons. Unfortunately, until this recent Ukraine-Russia conflict, when all these conservatives who came around, allegedly, and claimed to no longer support all these foreign wars, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, they snapped back immediately, right back to their neoconservative tendencies. And if you're saying, well, Dave, why is this a neocon issue? Well, if we go back to the Iraq War, we have the Project for a New North American Century, which is a think tank, a neocon think tank, that really helped plan the Iraq War. And one of the co-founders for PNAC was Robert Kagan. Now, who was Robert Kagan married to? He's married to Victoria Nuland, who has been on the ground in Ukraine since 2013, and who was instrumental in helping the Maidan Revolution that overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. So Victoria Nuland is married to the king of neocons, and Victoria Nuland is a massive neocon. And in 2016, we had McCain and Lindsey Graham go to Kiev and tell them, we're going to get you weapons so you can go fight the Russians. So this whole Ukraine project has all of these neocons who supported both Iraq wars, here again supporting a conflict with Russia. So it's kind of funny when conservatives say, oh no, this has nothing to do with neocons, this is a different situation. But just by chance, everybody who supported the Iraq war is 100% behind this same conflict. And I would argue because, again, this is a neocon project, just like the Iraq war was a neocon project. And all these conservatives who claim to have learned from Donald Trump, they're right back here supporting war. And I heard one prominent conservative say, why are people complaining about this $100 billion being spent in Ukraine? The bigger issue is our domestic spending at home. And I stopped to think about that, and I said, wait a second. You're saying we shouldn't worry about $100 billion going to Ukraine. We should worry about spending too much money on American citizens at home? That's your argument? If that's your argument, wow, terrible. Screw the American people. Let's spend it over there. And let's make sure we cut the spending at home. So let's cut Medicare and Social Security. That's not important. We need to give Zelensky more weapons and make sure the government of Ukraine has their pensions paid and all their salaries given out. That's what's important. Now, tying this into George Soros. Now, these same conservatives who support this war also hate George Soros. If you watch Fox News and listen to radio, they talk about George Soros all the time, pointing out that he backs all of these radical district attorneys like Kim Fox, I think Gardner out in St. Louis, all of these radical DAs who will not press charges against Antifa and Black Lives Matter when they loot and destroy things. And these conservatives rightly point out that George Soros is corrosive for American society, and he's looking to undermine traditional American society. He is a huge negative. And he's been a boogeyman on the right for probably now decades, going back to the early 2000s, listening to talk radio and on TV. George Soros, bad guy. Now, here's a problem. George Soros also is active internationally. The same people that call out George Soros constantly for being horrible for America completely ignore his activities in Eastern Europe. George Soros has spent almost $200 million in Ukraine. He has spent tens of millions of dollars in Georgia. Matter of fact, he was so important to Ukraine that the president of Ukraine, I think it was in 2016, Poroshenko, presented to George Soros the Order of Freedom. So he got the Order of Freedom from the president of Ukraine for his activities in Ukraine. And this is the president who became president after the previous one was disposed and he left office in 2014 in February. So my question is, if George Soros is bad for America, how is he not also bad for Ukraine? And the answer is, of course, he's bad for Ukraine. The issue, though, is that as much as conservatives, the neocons, hate George Soros in America, they hate Russia even more. And that's pretty amazing because they obviously, you watch Fox News, hate George Soros here. And this is my big problem with the Ukraine war, is we have a lot of hypocrites when it comes to our activities. Not just our aggression and trying to expand NATO, funding NGOs, our State Department there, Victoria Nuland on the ground, handing out cookies in 2013, undermining the governments of Ukraine. And then we have George Soros, who's also there doing the same exact thing, and all of it gets ignored. The whole thing starts in February 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. That's when it started. Ignore the previous 8 years. Don't even talk about it. And that's what these neocons do. And unfortunately, this is what the conservatives in the mainstream are also doing, who are going along with this war. And what's irritating is that they claim, well, we're not neocons. We're just conservatives. This is the good war. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Okay, those were a mess. But this one, we promise you, this one's the real one. This one's the important one. This one is the genuine one that we should all support. And I call BS. This is just another neocon project. And if we go back to 2021, December, the one thing the media doesn't do is tell you what Russia was doing before they invaded. All the overtures they made to us, offering peace plans, saying, hey, let's sit down and negotiate. We ignore them completely. We wouldn't sit down with Putin and have a talk with him. We wouldn't even acknowledge his existence. It was just, go away. We're doing this in Ukraine. And if you invade, you're the bad guy. And they did invade, the Russians. And these neocons said, see Putin, he's the bad guy. Just ignore the previous 8 years and everything he did to try to avoid this conflict, which has been going on since 2014 because there's been this civil war in the Donbass for the last 8 years that has killed over 10,000 people. The war didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014. And one of the biggest financiers for Ukraine has been George Soros. And our conservatives here completely ignore it because they're hypocrites and because they hate Russia even more than they hate George Soros. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.